There is a lake in the Italian Alps lake Resia, in the province of South Tyrol, where, if you stand on the shore on a clear morning and look out across the water, you will see something that should not be there. A bell tower. Rising from the centre of the lake, its stone base disappearing into 40 feet of water, its 14th century Romanesque stonework still intact. Still standing after 75 years of submersion. No church, no nave, no village square, no roads, no houses, no cemetery, just the tower. In July of 1950, the Italian government opened the gates of a new dam at the Reschen Pass. The water level of the lake rose by approximately 22 metres, and the village of Graun 160 homes, a school, a post office, a church built in the 1300s, a community that had existed in that valley for 600 years, disappeared beneath the surface. The residents watched from the shore. Some of them refused to leave their houses until the water was literally rising around their ankles. The last family to leave, a farmer named Hans Nogler and his wife, walked out of their front door with the water already above the threshold. He locked the door behind him. Nobody has ever explained why he did that. Perhaps he wasn't sure it was permanent. Perhaps it was simply what you did when you left your house. The lock is still there, 60 feet underwater. But this is not a story about a dam. It is a story about what the dam was for and what it was not for. Because the flooding of Graun in 1950 did not begin with an engineering decision. It began with a political decision made 30 years earlier, in 1919, when Italy annexed a region it had never governed, whose people did not speak Italian, and whose villages had German names that the Italian government was determined to erase. The dam was the last step in a process that started with a map and a pen. This is the vertical archive. The valley that Italy inherited AND did not want to understand why the village of Graun was flooded. You have to go back 31 years before the water rose. October 1919. The First World War had just ended. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the vast multi-ethnic state that had governed much of Central Europe for centuries, had collapsed. Its territories were being divided among the victorious powers according to the principle of national self-determination. Each people should, in theory, govern themselves. In the Alps, this principle ran immediately into a problem. The region known as South Tyrol, the South Tyrol, sat on the southern slopes of the Alps, below the Brenner Pass. It had been part of the county of Tyrol under Habsburg rule for more than 500 years. Its people were, overwhelmingly, German speakers. In 1910, a census had found that approximately 90% of the population of South Tyrol spoke German as their mother tongue. The Ladin-speaking minority accounted for another several percent. Italian speakers were a small fraction of the population recent arrivals, mostly from the south. By every standard of national self-determination that the Paris Peace Conference was supposedly applying, South Tyrol should have become part of Austria. It did not. Italy had entered the First World War on the Allied side in 1915, and the price of that alliance, negotiated in the secret Treaty of London, had included a promise. If Italy fought, Italy would receive South Tyrol, right up to the Brenner Pass, which provided a defensible alpine frontier. The strategic logic was clear. The ethnic logic was convenient to ignore. In October 1920, South Tyrol was formally annexed to Italy. The German-speaking population of Graun and of Reschen, and of Mals, and of every other village in the upper Vinschgau Valley went to bed as subjects of the Austrian Empire, and woke up as citizens of a country whose language they did not speak, and whose government they had not chosen. Ettore Tolomei AND, the renaming in 1923, the Italian government appointed a man named Ettore Tolomei as commissioner for the region. Tolomei was an Italian nationalist who had been arguing for decades that South Tyrol was historically and culturally Italian, a claim that required him to largely ignore the evidence of the landscape, the churches, the family names, the dialect, the architecture, and the 600 years of continuous German-speaking habitation. He had a particular gift, however, for administration. Mussolini's regime began a systematic Italianization program from 1922 onward. German was banned from schools, from official documents, from public signage. Place names were translated into Italian, Bozen became Bolzano, Brixen became Bressanon, Meran became Merano. The village of Graun became Curon Venosta. Reschen became Resia. Read that list again. Graun became Curon. Reschen became Resia. The very names the Italian government would later use to describe the flooding the villages of Curon and Resia were names that Tolomei had invented 30 years earlier, imposed on communities that had called themselves by different names for centuries. The erasure was linguistic before it was hydrological. German-speaking teachers were dismissed and replaced with Italian speakers from the south. The use of German in public was punishable by fine, and, after 1934, by imprisonment. Tens of thousands of Italian workers from the south were resettled into the province to dilute the German-speaking majority. The people of Graun lived through all of this. They watched their children come home from school unable to speak the language their grandparents had used. They watched the road signs change. They watched strangers from the south arrive in their valley and receive preferential treatment in land allocation and employment. And then, in 1939, came the choice that history records as the South Tyrol Option Agreement. Under the 1939 South Tyrol Option Agreement, Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini determined the status of ethnic Germans and Ladins living in the region. All places, down to the tiniest hamlet, were given Italian names, and even family names were translated. The choice was stark: leave South Tyrol and emigrate to Nazi Germany, giving up the land your family had farmed for centuries, or stay in Italy and accept forced assimilation. It was hugely divisive. If you stayed, you were called a traitor, and if you left, you were seen as a Nazi. Even now, you can see splits in families, in my own family, over who decided to stay or to go. The families of Graun who chose to stay, who could not bring themselves to abandon the valley, the farms, the graves, stayed with the understanding that they were accepting Italy's terms. They had no idea what those terms would eventually require of them, because the dam had been planned since the 1920s. The flooding of their valley had been on the drawing board for 30 years before the water rose, and no one had told them. The plan that predated the people, the idea of damming the Reschen Pass valley to create a hydroelectric reservoir, was not new in 1950. It was not even new in 1940. The first engineering surveys of the valley as a potential reservoir site were conducted in the early 1920s, almost immediately after Italy annexed the region. The Montecatini Company, a powerful Italian industrial conglomerate with deep connections to the fascist government, had identified the valley as one of the most suitable hydroelectric sites in the entire Alpine Arc. The geography was ideal. The valley sat at 1,498 metres above sea level. Two natural lakes, Lago di Resia and the smaller Lago di Curon, already existed there, fed by alpine meltwater. A dam at the northern end would merge the two lakes and raise the water level by approximately 22 metres, creating a reservoir of 120 million cubic metres. The electricity generated would power the growing industrial cities of northern Italy, Milan, Turin, Brescia. The problem, of course, was that people lived there, not just a few people. The valley contained multiple villages: Graun, Reschen, Arlong, Piz, Gorf, and several smaller settlements. Hundreds of families, farms that had been cultivated for centuries. Churches, cemeteries, schools. Under any normal planning framework, the existence of those communities would have been the first consideration. Under the fascist framework, it was a secondary consideration at best. The 7 years of fighting the residents of Graun and Reschen were not passive. When the dam plans became public in the early 1940s, the communities organised. Petitions were drawn up and sent to Rome in Italian, since that was the only language now permitted in official correspondence, though many of the signatories spoke it imperfectly. Legal appeals were filed through the courts. Local officials wrote letters to ministerial offices. The villagers were German-speaking South Tyroleans who had spent 7 years trying to stop the project through legal appeals, petitions to Rome, and a final intervention from the Bishop of Bressanone that arrived the day before the gates opened. 7 years. From 1943, when construction began in earnest, until July 1950, when the water rose. The communities of the Reschen Pass Valley fought every legal mechanism available to them to prevent the destruction of their homes. They lost at every stage. The war interrupted construction but did not cancel it. When Italy emerged from the Second World War in 1945, the dam project resumed with the new post-war government's support. The economic argument was compelling. Italy needed electricity. The Alpine valleys could provide it. The communities displaced were small. The industrial benefit was national. What makes the history of Graun particularly sharp is a detail that most accounts of the flooding do not emphasize. The residents were not told the final water level until construction was already underway. The original plans, as presented to the local population in the 1940s, suggested a water level rise of approximately 8 meters, enough to flood some low-lying farmland, but not the villages themselves. The compensation packages offered were calculated on this basis. The dam was built, causing the water level to rise significantly more than anticipated. Consequently, the villages of Curon and Resia were submerged, forcing the residents to abandon their homes. When the actual water level rose 22 meters, nearly 3 times what had been described, the communities had no legal recourse remaining. The appeals were exhausted. The compensation had been paid based on the lower figure. The houses were already being demolished. More than 160 homes were blown up with explosives before the flooding to prevent them from becoming navigation hazards in the new reservoir. The church itself, the Church of St. Catherine, whose tower you can still see today, was deconsecrated and demolished. The other 2 bells were sent to other parishes in the diocese. The tower at Graun was empty for the first time in 6 centuries. Through the autumn of 1949 and the spring of 1950, the houses of Graun were systematically dynamited. Only the tower was left standing. Nobody recorded why. The engineering logic would have argued for demolishing it. A submerged tower is a navigation hazard, just as a submerged wall is. But somebody decided to leave it. Perhaps it was sentiment. Perhaps it was bureaucratic oversight. Perhaps someone with authority over that decision could not bring themselves to order the tower's destruction as well. Whatever the reason, the tower remained. And when the water rose, it stood there alone above the lake surface, a stone finger pointing upward. The last residents of Graun were evacuated in the spring and early summer of 1950. Also, unforgettable was watching the floodwaters advance day by day into the valley, the creeping death of countless dreams and a way of life held dear. The memory haunts many to this day. On July 17, 1950, the dam gates at the Reschen Pass were closed. The water began to rise. The day the water came, Maria Moser was in her mid-30s when the water came. She had been born in Graun. Her parents had been born in Graun. The house where she grew up, stone walls, a wooden gallery on the south face, a view east toward the Ortler Massif, had been in her family since her grandfather built it in 1891. She had watched the construction crews arrive. She had watched the explosions take the houses of her neighbours one by one. She had watched the water in the natural lake begin to rise as the dam neared completion. And she had stayed, not from stubbornness, or not only from stubbornness. She stayed because leaving felt like giving the government what it wanted. It had spent 30 years trying to erase the German character of her valley, changing the names, banning the language. flooding the schools with teachers from the south. The dam was just the final act in a programme that had been running since before she was in school. If she left before the water touched her threshold, she would never know, not truly, in her body, what had been taken. So she waited. The water came slowly at first. It filled the meadows below the village. It covered the road that connected Graun to Reschen. It reached the walls of the lowest houses, the ones that had already been emptied, already been stripped of furniture and fixtures, already been dynamited in their structural bones to prevent them standing as permanent hazards. Then it reached her street. She stood in her kitchen and watched the water come under the door. She picked up the last object. She was taking a small wooden crucifix from the wall above the fireplace and walked out. Her husband locked the door behind them, not because there was anything left inside worth protecting, but because that was what you did when you left your house. You locked the door. They walked up the hill to where the other remaining families were standing, and they watched. The water rose all afternoon. By evening, the roof of the church was beneath the surface. By morning, only the tower remained. The residents of Graun were relocated to a newly built village on the hillside above the lake. Its streets were laid out to mimic, as closely as possible, the pattern of the old village below the water. The same neighbours, the same relative positions of houses, the same orientation toward the mountains. The Italian government called this a fair solution. The people of Graun called it something else. They had a word for what they felt, a German word, one of those untranslatable compound nouns that contains a whole experience in its syllables. Heimweh, homesickness, but not the ordinary homesickness of being far from home. The specific, incurable homesickness of knowing that home still exists, that its walls are still standing, its floors still intact, its door still locked but that you cannot reach it, that it is 40 feet below the surface of a cold alpine lake, and that it will be there long after you are gone. What they found when the water left in 2021, 71 years after the flooding, the dam required maintenance. The famous scent. Catherine Church Bell Tower stands in the drained Lake Reschen, Resia, Italy, May 14, 2021. After years of being mostly submerged, the ruins have now reappeared due to maintenance work requiring the draining of the Lake Reschen in the Vinschgau Valley near the Austrian border. For the first time in 7 decades, the village of Graun emerged from the water. What the people who walked through it found was not ruins in the usual archaeological sense. It was a village. Walls standing, steps intact, the outlines of rooms visible in the stone, doorways still framed, the village square still showing its original paving stones under decades of silt. It was weird to walk through the middle of the rubble of the houses, said one local resident. I thought about what life must have been like in the village before the dam was built, but what nobody had systematically catalogued, what was not part of the maintenance drainage plan, what had simply never been prioritised in the 70 years the village sat underwater, was the archaeology beneath the village itself. Because Graun did not sit on empty alpine ground. The Reschen Pass had been a major transit route since Roman times. The road through the valley connected the Italian peninsula with the Danube basin. It was one of the primary Roman military and trade routes across the Alps. Archaeological finds from the valley date to the Bronze Age. The Roman period is particularly well documented coins, pottery fragments, structural remains. All recovered from the surrounding area in various surveys. What lay directly beneath the medieval village of Graun, beneath the foundations that the 20th century families had built on, beneath the church whose tower still stands in the water, had never been systematically excavated. When the water drained in 2021, archaeologists had weeks, not the years or decades that a site of this complexity and significance would normally receive. Weeks before the maintenance was complete and the reservoir would fill again. Remnants of the town like bricks, rubble, steps and some walls are visible. What they found in those weeks confirmed what the historical maps had already suggested: there were structural remains beneath the medieval village that predated it by centuries. The Reschen Pass Roman road ran directly through the flooded zone. The foundations of the Church of St. Catherine, the church whose tower still stands, showed evidence of construction on top of earlier stonework that did not match the Romanesque building period. Something was there before the 14th century church. What it was, how significant, how old, how well preserved under the protective layer of lake sediment, was not fully determined before the water rose again. The lake refilled. The village went back under. The archaeology went with it. This is the thing that nobody asked in 1950. Not because the question was unimportant, but because the question was inconvenient. If you ask what is already down there, if you require an archaeological survey before flooding a valley that has been continuously inhabited since the Roman period, you risk finding something that would complicate or delay the dam. In 1950, in post-war Italy, with a government desperate for industrial capacity and a Montecatini company with contracts to honour, delays were not welcome. The survey was not done. The water came up, and whatever was beneath the medieval village of Graun is now preserved perfectly in the cold, oxygen-poor water of an alpine reservoir 60 feet below the surface of Lake Resia. Waiting, the other village's Graun is the best known of the flooded villages because of the bell tower. But it was not alone. Across northern Italy, in the decades between the 1930s and the 1960s, the construction of hydroelectric infrastructure submerged dozens of communities. The pattern was consistent: an industrial company with government backing, a valley with the right geography, a community without the legal or political power to resist, and a planning process that moved faster than the appeals. Fabbriche di Careggine, Tuscany, in the mountains of the Garfagnana region of Tuscany. A different kind of submersion happened. Lago di Vagli is an artificial body of water created in 1953 when the Tuscan valley in which it sits was flooded with the building of a dam. At the bottom of the lake is a 12th century medieval town, Fabbriche di Careggine, an ancient settlement. Originally settled in the 1200s by a group of blacksmiths, the tiny town managed to survive for hundreds of years, well into the 20th century, with just over 30 buildings and around 146 inhabitants. Work on the dam started in 1941 for hydroelectric purposes. Construction was delayed because of the outbreak of World War II, but was completed in 1947 at just over 300 feet tall. Unlike Graun, the village of Fabbriche di Careggine was already nearly abandoned before the flooding. Its economy had declined over the previous century, but nearly abandoned is not the same as empty. The remaining residents were relocated. The stone houses built by medieval ironworkers, constructed to last centuries, were left intact. In a matter of hours, 34 million cubic meters of water submerged the entire village, its 31 houses, the bridge with 3 arches, and the Romanesque church of Sant'Eudoro, which, with its bell tower, is the tallest part of this mini Atlantis. The lake has been drained 4 times since its creation, in 1958, 1974, 1983, and 1994. Each time, the village has emerged in an extraordinary state of preservation. The stone walls still standing, the church still recognisable, the 3-arched bridge still intact. It was last drained in 1994. Sources say it drew approximately 1 million visitors, all of them anxious to see these archaeological ruins that experts date back to the 12th or 13th century. 1 million people came to see a drowned village. People talk about 2026, 30 years after the last emptying, as the next scheduled drainage which would make it, if the timing holds, potentially visible again in the same year this episode is being made. An old local tale says something that has been repeated in the valley for generations, when the lake is drained and the town re-emerges. Its old dwellers come back to their houses. Nobody takes it literally. But nobody entirely dismisses it either. The dam that killed its own builder's logic there is a darker coda to the Italian dam building era one that happened not in the flooding but in what came after. The Vajont Dam is a disused dam in northern Italy. On 9 October 1963, during initial filling, a landslide caused a mega tsunami in the lake in which water overtopped the dam in a wave, which brought massive flooding and destruction to the Piave Valley below, leading to the destruction of several villages and towns, causing an estimated 1,900 to 2,500 deaths. This event occurred after Enel, and the Italian government concealed reports and dismissed evidence that Monte Toc was geologically unstable. The Vajont disaster, in which a government-backed dam company ignored its own geological surveys, concealed evidence of instability, and then watched a mountainside fall into their reservoir and kill nearly 2,000 people, is the endpoint of the same logic that flooded Graun. The logic that said, the industrial benefit is worth more than what it costs. That said, the people in the valley are a secondary consideration. That said, the surveys can wait, the appeals can be dismissed, the questions need not be answered. At Graun, that logic cost a village. At Vajont, it cost 2,000 lives. The dam is still standing at Vajont. It will never hold water again. A permanent monument to what happens when the question what's already down there is not asked until it is too late. What the tower means in winter, Lake Resia freezes. When it freezes solidly enough, which happens in most years, visitors walk across the ice to the bell tower of St. Catherine. They touch the stone. They look down through the ice at the street below, on very clear days, when the ice is clean and the light is right. You can see the outline of the buildings 60 feet down, the paving stones of the village square, the walls of houses that no longer have roofs, the geometry of streets that no cars will ever drive on again. The tower has become, over the 7 decades since the flooding, one of the most photographed places in Italy. Some claim to hear the church bells tolling, adding to the eerie aura of the place. The bells were removed before the flooding. They are in other churches now, but the story persists anyway. Sound carries strangely in the mountains. The wind through the tower's empty bell frame makes a particular sound. People who hear it, and already know the story of the village, hear what they expect to hear. In the following years, the area became a popular tourist attraction for its scenery, blue waters, mountains, and of course the lonely steeple. During the winters, Lake Resia froze over, allowing people to walk across the ice to the bell tower. There is an Italian Netflix series also called Curon that uses the tower as its central image. The 2020 TV series Curon narrates the story of a woman who returns to Curon with her twins, uncovering the town's secrets. Millions of people watched it. Most of them had never heard of the real Graun before. The tower became famous through fiction. The history beneath the fiction is, as it almost always is, more complicated and more interesting. What the tower is the bell tower of St. Catherine's Church has been standing for approximately 700 years. It was built sometime in the early 14th century. It stood through the plague years of the 1340s, through the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, through the Napoleonic Wars, through the Austrian period, through the Italian annexation, through fascism, through the Second World War, through the dam campaign, through the flooding. It has been standing in a lake for 75 years. It will, barring earthquake or deliberate demolition, continue to stand long after everyone alive today is gone. What the tower is, in the clearest possible terms, is a document. It documents the fact that a village existed here, that people built it, that they maintained it for 6 centuries, that they were removed against their will, that the water was raised over their homes and their church and their cemeteries and their streets. The tower is the only part of that record that you can see from the shore without a diving mask. Everything else is still there. The village is still there. The foundations of whatever the Romans built before the medieval village are still there. The archaeology that was never done, the surveys that were never conducted, the questions that were never asked, the answers to all of them are still there, under 40 feet of cold, remarkably clear alpine water. In 1950, when a government decides to flood a valley, it asks one question: how much will this cost? It means, how much compensation? How much construction? How much infrastructure? It does not ask, what is already here? What are we covering up? What are we removing from the world permanently? And what do we owe to its permanence? Those questions are inconvenient. They were inconvenient in 1950. They are inconvenient now, every time a dam is proposed, every time a valley is assessed for development potential. Every time the engineering maps are laid out and the people in the valley are described as a secondary consideration. The tower is still there, still asking. The water is very clear if you visit Lake Resia today, and you should. If you are ever in South Tyrol in summer, you can rent a boat. You can row out to the tower. You can tie your boat to the iron ring that is still attached to the tower's stone base, where generations of Graun residents once tied their boats to exactly the same ring during summer flood seasons when the natural lake ran high. And you can look down. The water is very clear. The lake sits at 1,498 meters above sea level, fed by alpine meltwater. Cold enough to inhibit the algae that cloud lower altitude reservoirs. On a calm morning, the visibility is extraordinary. You can see the outlines, the street grid, the foundation walls, the individual cobblestones of the village square 60 feet below you, completely intact, perfectly preserved in the cold and the dark. Hans Nogler's front door is still locked. Nobody has ever opened it. The village of Fabbriche di Careggine in Tuscany is expected to emerge again around this time, the lake drainage long overdue. The stone walls patient as they have been for 80 years of submersion. When it surfaces, the medieval church of San Teodoro will reappear. The three-arched bridge, the ironworkers' houses, the village square where, in the 14th century, someone was building something that a Mussolini-era dam company decided did not need to be understood. 1 million people came the last time. The question, what's already down there, has still never been fully answered. This has been the Vertical Archive. We follow the traces that other histories decided not to follow. We will see you next time.